We planted the same kind of garlic 8 different ways to see how soil, clove size, growing time, spacing, and fertilizer make a difference on the final garlic harvest. But unfortunately, all 11 of our test beds got diseased at the same time. Instead of pulling out the garlic, we left it in the ground for 5 more weeks and got bulbs as big as this and as small as this. I'm gonna share how we prepped each bed and what effects that had on the final harvest. In our little garden experiment, we were working with only one kind of garlic, Inchelium red soft neck garlic, which at full size is supposed to get as big as your fist. To prepare the garlic, we did not plant it in the ground over the winter. Instead, we vernalized it in the fridge for 8 weeks. After that, we divided into small, medium, and large cloves. The smallest cloves being as big as the largest cloves that you would find at the supermarket. For all the beds except for the one, we prepped each clove by putting a dab of worm castings onto the root side of each clove before putting it 6 inches deep and planting them 6 inches apart. Every single clove that we planted sprouted. Then, after 11.5 weeks or about 80 days, they all started showing signs of disease, the spots on the leaves. This disease is likely a fungal infection known as garlic rust, and I believe it was caused by overwatering. After noticing the disease, we left it in the ground for 5 more weeks before harvesting. That was everything that was the same between all the cloves. Now I'm gonna walk you through the differences in how we prepped each bed. In total, there were 11 patches. So for patch 0, also known as the compost patch, it was 100% compost. We planted large cloves and it got 12 weeks of growing time. That's before the disease got to it and started showing up. We had some of the largest final bulbs from this patch. In patch 1, we took clay and mixed it in with the old soil that was already there. Then we watered the soil and covered it with cardboard and overwintered it like that so it could kill any of the weed seeds. After overwintering, we put down a layer of compost and planted in medium cloves that got 12 weeks of growing time. For patch 2, it was the exact same prep, including medium cloves, but the difference was that it got an extra week of growing time. In patch 3, we prepped the soil by throwing down a layer of clay mixed with Home Depot potting soil. The potting soil looked basically like old mulch. There were a bunch of wood chips in it. And then on top of that, we threw down a layer of compost. In here, we planted large cloves and they got 11 weeks of growing time. In patches 4 and 5, there was the same soil prep as 3, but instead of just large cloves, we planted a mix of medium and large cloves. In total, they got 12 weeks of growing time. Shockingly, the biggest bulb came from patch 4, not the compost patch. In patches 6 and 7, we did not add anything to the soil. There were no amendments. Then, 2 weeks later, we spot applied compost to each of the little garlic sprouts that were coming up. We basically pulled aside the mulch, dropped a handful of compost, put back the mulch on top, and watered it in. In this patch, we used the small cloves and had them grow for 10 weeks. In patches 8 and 9, we prepped the soil by taking 50% peat moss, 50% Home Depot potting soil, some native soil. We threw that all into the bed and mixed it into the original old soil that was there. 2 weeks later, we did the same thing of spot applying compost. In here, it was also small cloves that got 10 weeks of growing time. In our final patch, we used only the old soil. We did not add any amendments until 2 weeks later when we spot applied compost. On top of that, we did not put worm castings on the roots. The cloves in here were also small and got 10 weeks of growing time, but we did give them wider spacing. Now that you know how each of the 11 beds were prepped, I'm gonna walk you through how that made a difference on the final garlic harvest.
Did an extra week of grow time impact final bulb size?
If we compare patches 1 and 2, there was little to no difference, so that extra week didn't really do anything.
Did 100% compost do better than just partial compost?
If we compare the compost patch with patches 4 and 5, we'll see that the compost patch has bulbs that are only slightly larger. This makes me believe that as long as we meet like a bare minimum for compost, it will get you your results.
How much growing time did planting larger cloves save?
Comparing the final bulbs in patch 3 and patch 2, you'll see that they're about the same size. So even though patch 2 had 2 more weeks of growing time, the large cloves in patch 3 made up for that.
Why did mixing in peat moss and Home Depot soil result in smaller bulbs?
If you compare patches 6 and 7 with patches 8 and 9, you'll see that the bulbs in patch 6 and 7 were bigger. This might be because mixing in the peat moss and the Home Depot soil might have started the breakdown process again and resulted in nitrogen being pulled away from the garlic plant.
How did worm castings and spacing impact bulb size?
If you compare patch 10 with patches 6 and 7, you'll see that the worm castings on the roots did make a difference in the final bulb. However, giving additional spacing did not improve the size of the bulb in any way. This might be because it never even grew big enough to actually need that extra space that it got.
What difference did the size of the original clove planted make?
If you compare patch 3 that had large cloves with patches 8 and 9 that started with small cloves, you'll see that the size of the original clove that got planted does matter, and bigger starting cloves do result in bigger bulbs on average. But if you have the space, you should plant all your cloves because some of the bulbs that were the small cloves caught up to the ones that were the large cloves.
Can you prevent garlic rust from spreading?
If you look at how the patch 10 got more spacing, compare that with all the other ones that had just 6-inch spacing, having more space in between each garlic plant does not stop garlic rust or the disease from spreading. If you're fast enough, you could separate the diseased ones out, but if all of them are overwatered, then they're all gonna get diseased. My conclusions are that garlic rust is not that big a problem. If your garlic already had 10 to 13 weeks to grow, you're gonna get pretty decent sized bulbs. It's not gonna be as big as it could have gotten, but it's not too bad. For next year, I'm gonna try experimenting with 8-inch spacing and 6-inch spacing. With 6-inch spacing, I like that I can fit in more cloves, so you have a higher chance of that small one turning into a big bulb. But the benefit of more spacing is that, look, each clove has the room to potentially grow to its max size and not overcrowd and smash into the other ones and fight for nutrients. Vernalizing in the fridge worked really well for me, so I'm gonna do that again next year. In terms of compost, instead of doing a layer just spread across the entire thing or filling an entire bed with compost, I think the most economical way to use the compost to get the fattest bulb is to put compost directly under the clove and directly above the clove. That way the garlic's roots get the nutrients from the bottom, and the little on top compost, as you water it in, that's like a slow release fertilizer. Something that I noticed was that we might not need to plant the garlic as deep as we did. The full 6 inches, when we were digging it out, it was a little difficult to get it out. And the reasoning for planting it at least 6 inches deep is to help with the overwintering process so that when the ground freezes potentially and thaws, it doesn't push your clove above the ground. But since we're skipping that by doing the fridge vernalization, we could settle for a shallower berry, which would hypothetically mean that we could grow bigger cloves with less soil. We also gotta water less. We could have avoided this entire garlic rust disease incident if we had just not watered so much. Like, this garlic can tolerate dryness. I've seen people grow garlic with absolutely no added water. They just watered it in the beginning and then let it dry garden for the rest. We could learn from that. A drier yet healthy garlic plant will do a lot better than one that's overwatered and diseased.